Hi everybody, this is Scott Dudley from SaaS Startup Stories, and today my special guest is Slater Victoroff, who's based in Boston. Slater is the CTO at Indico Data, which unlocks the value of unstructured data, delivering measurable impact across your enterprise. Welcome to the show, Slater. Are you ready to rock and roll?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
You're welcome. All right, so I guess we'll get straight into it and start off with your background and what initially got you interested in starting a SaaS company.
Yeah, so I grew up in LA and then came out to Boston for college. When I first showed up at school, believe it or not, I had never written a line of code. I had never owned my own computer, and I believed that entrepreneurship was a euphemism for unemployment. But as all things go, the line of history never quite flies straight. And I showed up at the first career fair, and I thought at the time that I was going to be a material science engineer. And I very quickly realized that that was a path that would require sort of another decade of schooling, which I was really not prepared for. And that even then, sort of the best case scenario was, working on an oil rig, 6 months out of the year. And I found software, and the bug just absolutely bit me. From the time that I first found it, I saw, all of the jobs in software, so said, this is worth paying attention to. And for the next 2.5 years, I actually spent an average of 12 hours a day programming. I just loved it so much.
Okay, excellent. All right. So did you borrow VC money to launch the SaaS company, or did you bootstrap it instead? Tell us a bit about how you got Indico Data off the ground.
Yeah, so we were a classic dorm room company, if you will. So for the first year, we did raise a small amount of money. There are these kind of student VC firms. They usually call it pizza money, right? So we brought some pizza money on. We used it for pizza, specifically pineapple and onion pizza. And so that was really for the first year, I would say, of Indico, right? Was from the hours of 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. on Sunday nights. We were working together and really just building software tools and trying to say, can we build something useful? Can we get better at this technology, right? Can we find a way to make this technology accessible to people? And then, as all things go, it kind of took on a life of its own. Users started to grow. We started to get some groundswell and some indications that we were onto something real. And then, we've raised a reasonable amount of VC money at this point, a little north of $35 million as of, our Series B earlier this year.
Okay, so is it just yourself, or is there some other founders as well?
Yeah, so we've got, so it was initially me and Alec Radford, my co-founder, and then Madison, May, and Diana Yuan also joined. Alec is an advisor, and me, Madison, and Diana are all still with the company. Okay. And we're about 70 folks right now.
Oh, okay, growing. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right, so I guess the interesting question is, how did you get your first 10 customers at the very beginning?
Yeah, so it's interesting because we lived through maybe 2 different iterations of this, right? Is that we first lived through kind of a, Indico V1 that was very developer centric, right? How do we get our first 10 developers? And then Indico V2 was really an enterprise model, right? So a very, very different kind of journey, right? And 10 customers means something very different in both cases, right? Yeah. 10 customers as a developer kind of, consumption-based model, sort of an Alchemy API type offering, was almost nothing, right? That was very, very little traction, right? We weren't even breaking, $1 million in ARR. Very different when you start talking about 10 enterprise sort of B2B customers.
Yeah.
The developers were easier, right? I think that a lot of that was making really good software. We went to a lot of hackathons, and really, I think that in so many ways, your first 10 customers are always going to be gotten by doing things that aren't going to scale. And that's sort of intentional. And in those early days, we really just got it in the hands of as many people as possible, right? We sort of gave it away for free under the hope that some people eventually would pay us. And eventually they did. However, that wasn't great for us in a lot of different ways. And so to talk about sort of the enterprise piece, where we basically realized that a single enterprise deal was going to make us more money than the entirety of all of the other deals that we had sold in our lifetime, right? That's when we decided it was really time to shift over. And the first, honestly, was just cold reach out. It was me personally figuring out, okay, who can use this? And I reached out, and it was a volume and numbers game, right?
Yep.
And the first pass didn't get us our first 10, right? The first pass got us our first 1 and 2 and 3, right? So it was slowly going. Yep. But then, it's the kind of thing that really takes on a life of its own. We always call it sort of the flywheel. So you just have to, I think, really commit to putting in those early cycles, and it will pay off. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of persistence.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, interesting. All right, so I guess tell me a bit about the Indico Data product and also the ever-growing importance of intelligent automation.
Yeah, absolutely. So our product, very broadly speaking, puts this cutting edge intelligent automation software in the hands of subject matter experts. So the traditional model in the space might be that you want to process a kind of contract, right, or an invoice, right, or some other kind of complex piece of unstructured data. And you would then go around and say, all right, who happens to have an invoice model that works exactly for my data? And the answer is always no one, right? So you kind of find, okay, who is as close as possible to it? And the reason that people tend to operate in that way is because making sort of a single model for contracts, right, or annual reports or anything, it's so expensive, right? And it's kind of very, very siloed. However, when you look at the large enterprises, right, they don't have 1 and 2 and 3 use cases. They've got 150 use cases. So the question is, how do you enable sort of a fundamentally more sustainable model for getting after those use cases? And that's really where our product comes in. And we use a lot of fancy technology to do this. But the idea is that you buy a platform that allows you to then build your own invoice model, build your own contract model, and do it in a week or two. And in doing so, kind of get after sort of your whole kind of portfolio of use cases.
Okay, cool. All right. So with that in mind, what are your thoughts on the future of AI in business?
I think that as much progress has been made in the past couple of years, and I don't think I've got to convince anyone of the rapid acceleration and adoption across the business. I think that something that people don't necessarily pay that much attention to is that most of the progress has happened on the structured data side, right? So when you look at business intelligence, right, and a lot of these market analytics, I think that stuff has gotten really, really good. Even when you look at data visualizations like Tableau, I think that stuff has come a really far way in the last couple of years. However, if you turn over to documents and OCR technology, right, you haven't seen the same kind of radical improvement there, right? That stuff has been dramatically neglected relative. And for every 10 use cases you got on the structured side, you maybe have 1 use case that's actually getting to completion on the unstructured side. Now, the unstructured use case is usually 10 times as valuable, but with traditional technologies, it's 100 times harder to build. And so that's why you see, Google and Facebook, obviously, they make, these massive waves with these amazing unstructured systems doing intelligent search and, complex computer vision and stuff along those lines. But that technology has not, as of yet, filtered down into even sophisticated enterprises, frankly, right? You've got sort of a very, very small group of folks at the top that have sort of the scale to make really effective use of it. And you've got a kind of growing group, if you sort of say out to the Fortune 500, where people have some mix of skills, but aren't, the literal top in the world. So we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we get these advantages and how do we kind of accelerate that adoption? Because they're now at the point, I think, where they've gotten a taste of what this automation can do specifically, right?
Agreed.
And they want so much more.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next few years. Yeah,
it really will be, I think. Yeah.
All right. So how is Indico Data making STEM more inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of pieces here. Obviously, I spend a lot of my time personally, volunteering and trying to, make STEM a little bit friendlier. I spend a lot of my time writing content, on Stack Overflow and Quora, and we put a lot of content on our blog. And, even things like this, right? Doing podcasts, just trying to make it clear to people that, AI is not magic, right? This stuff is technology like any other, right? And I think a lot of that is really key. I think another piece, and what I would really say is that from a philosophical perspective, we very much believe that the subject matter expert, sort of the citizen data scientist, if you will, right? We put them at the center in terms of the users that we're really trying to serve. Because I think that's so much of it is realizing that there simply are not going to be enough ML experts, right? Even programmers, right? There's not going to be enough programmers to serve our every need going to the future. So I think that idea much more of how do you make these technologies more accessible, and how do you encourage people to recognize that making technology as accessible is a goal in and of itself, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so, and I think obviously we're doing things there. There's a lot more that can be done, but I'm very happy to come from Olin College, which I believe is the only engineering school in the world with a 50-50 gender ratio. And
okay.
not that yeah, it's great, not that we're at that at Indico, but I think that we try to really think outside of the box in terms of what we really need and how we can effectively leverage diverse viewpoints.
Nice. Okay. All right. So what are your views on ethical AI, both in data collection and use and application?
Yeah, I think the most important analogy that I use for AI is people often want to think of AI as some objective arbiter of truth. And it's important to realize that it is not that, right? An AI system, it's not really something that's got autonomy. It's much more a mirror. But it's importantly not a perfect mirror. Imagine a mirror with 100 pockmarks kind of all over it. And so we show it some system, right, characterized by data. Really, that's how we're programming these effectively, is by showing them examples and showing them data. And the problem is that every one of those pockmarks, right, every little bit of that process that we're not considering, it's not that the model is going to make no assumption. It's that it's going to scatter it kind of randomly, is that pieces of that data it's going to ignore or magnify. And for that reason, I think what people really have to understand is the first step in ethical AI is understanding the system that you are mimicking, right? And not assuming that you will be able to solve these problems on the AI side afterwards. Because again, at the end of the day, right, these are human problems first and foremost, and we cannot really effectively create an ethical AI until we first define what an ethical process looks like. And I think a lot of people invert that a little bit.
Yeah, good point. I like that. All right. What are your most successful customer acquisition channels, and how did you find them?
Yeah, so we actually did a really big shift in this recently. Which is certainly in enterprise kind of B2B SaaS. What we realized is that our ability to reach the customer was so timing dependent, right? In intelligent automation and unstructured data and AI and the enterprise, right? And all of those subsegments, buying cycles are long. Customer uncertainty is high. Proof of concept failure rate is high, right?
Yes.
Success rates are low, right? It's a tricky industry in a lot of ways. We're very happy. We've got a 97% success rate in getting to production, but even that doesn't really matter unless you can cut through the noise upstream, right? And we used to do a more traditional sort of mix of, inbound and outbound and kind of partners and paid ads. What we did earlier is we just cut our outbound activities completely. Said we're going to stop cold calling people because it wasn't that we couldn't get into customers, right? It was that we weren't getting to them at the right time. Is that someone only wants to take a cold call when they've got a POC already set up, right? The whole kind of process is delineated and they're looking for vendor number 5, vendor number 6, right? On the inbound side, though, when you really craft kind of a comprehensive content strategy and put yourself in front of the customer as a resource first rather than a vendor, right? That's when you can actually really help them understand that the way that they set that proof of concept up, right? The way that they are evaluating things is going to be a huge predictor of whether or not they're successful. Believe it or not, when we don't help customers craft their proof of concept or their evaluation, the most common outcome of a proof of concept is no decision, right? And look, not as a vendor, right? Not as kind of any particular person, right? If you are doing an evaluation and the evaluation is not getting you to a definitive answer, it's a bad evaluation for everyone involved, right? And that's kind of the philosophy that we've got, is that you have to be really intentional in doing these things effectively. And I think a lot of people have a perception that AI is dramatically advanced beyond where it is. And so we find that the inbound strategies and sort of a really heavy content and sort of thought leadership presence helps to shift that thinking a little bit.
So you prefer to educate the people first so that they can understand what you do and then they can see the value in it.
Exactly. Right. I always say, try to have conversations valuable enough that the customer would have paid for the conversation alone.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. All right. Then on the flip side, how do you approach reducing churn and retaining paying customers?
Yeah. So this is actually something where I would say we've been extremely, extremely lucky. We basically don't have churn, right? In fact, we've got pretty impressive net revenue retention numbers, kind of up above 140% kind of annualized NRR, which is awesome, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And, I think, we'll probably talk about this in a little bit. We've almost got the inverse problem. So really what we care most about is being honest with the customer up front, right? I think that we are always known as the people that is going to tell the customer, hey, you've set this proof of concept up incorrectly, right? The way you're running this experiment is just not scientifically viable. And, these are the reasons you're not going to get to the result, you're looking for. And that can be tough at times, but it means that we're also extremely dogmatic about what success looks like. As we can tell our customers, look, if you follow our process, right, if you get this amount of data, right, and you work through these stages, we guarantee you will get to success. Everyone who does this gets to success. However, maybe a good way to think about it is someone else might pitch you success in 10 minutes, and they'll show you a demo in 10 minutes, but it turns out it actually takes 100 hours to get to success. For us, we won't do the 10-minute demo. We say we absolutely will not do the 10-minute demo. And maybe these are not real numbers. I'm just throwing stuff out, right? And maybe for us, it actually takes 2 hours to get to that success that would normally take 100 hours, right? But we try really hard not to inflate expectations ahead of time. And that's critical, for reducing churn, right? Is, customers churn when they feel like you've lied to them, and we reduce it by not lying to them.
Yeah. They haven't got what they've paid for, basically, which makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And if you deliver to them more than what they're paying for, then, they'll be happy to pay for it later. And you can figure out how to capture that value, later on, which has always been our philosophy.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. All right. So what would you say is the single biggest challenge you're experiencing right now with growing Indico Data?
Yeah, I think that the challenge is always, new iterations of storytelling. Right. I think our space has gotten really, really choppy. It's, it's nice. It's really flattering in some ways. We were very early to this space, and now it feels like there are, just vendors swarming, intelligent automation, and even, unstructured data specifically has kind of emerged as this thesis with a kind of shocking rapidity. And it's really nice on the one hand, right? Because it validates that we're solving a valuable problem. But on the flip side, it means there's extremely low trust in our industry, because frankly, it's a lot easier to make a demo work than to make real production AI work. Like the stuff that we do is very complex. And a lot of the folks trying to move into our industry have the perception that it's very easy. And then again, they'll deliver demos. So actually the success rate for production in our industry right now, something like 11%, right? Again, contrasted to sort of our 97%.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out how we help customers make good decisions in their buying process, because we want the overall industry to be more successful. Obviously, we hope some of that comes to us, but we think 11% is bad for everyone. And figuring out how to get customers to sort of overcome the trust gap also. We have customers that have evaluated, dozens of other vendors in our space, have potentially even made purchasing decisions with 7, 8 other vendors. And when that's happened, right, and when there's sort of like so much noise, figuring out the right messaging at the very top of the funnel, and also giving the customer the tools to really understand, what's going on and how to sift through things. That's our biggest challenge, right now.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. All right. And what's your favorite business book?
I think that, one of my favorite business books is Built to Last, right? I think that The Challenger Salesperson is another really, really wonderful one.
Okay. I've got both of those.
Nice.
Who wrote Built to Last again?
Oh gosh, actually, I'm gonna have to Google this because I'm terrible with names. It is right. Jerry Porras and Jim Collins collaborated on it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Jim Collins,
really
yeah.
great though. It's very interesting. I think the first time I heard someone tell me about it, he says, I'm trying to make a company that's going to last for 100 years. I'm like, that's insane.
It
right?
is, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
But
but I think it's a
basically
really cool mentality.
continues after you've passed away, basically. So yeah.
Yeah,
Excellent.
I mean, I think it's I think it's a dream everyone should aspire to.
Yeah. So what are you curious about or researching right now regarding SaaS or software in general?
I think one of the things I'm very interested in is new compute models, right? I think that one of the things that's really interesting is that consumption-based pricing has taken over the world, right? And I think that there's really interesting aspects to that. And I think one of the things that's also really fascinating is when you look at AI technologies, the way that their expense profiles work, it's just very different from normal software. Suddenly compute is a real concern again, right? You've got massive, massive data stores and they just look very different from traditional compute structures. And I think that finding models that both help SaaS companies kind of capture those recurring revenues while giving customers a way to kind of have transparency on the compute they're spending on and kind of optimize that appropriately. I'm very, very interested in those. I think there was a big surge in the initial, multi-tenant SaaS pricing models, right? And I think there's another surge happening as we see sort of these multi-tenant SaaS cloud monoliths become inappropriate for other use cases. What does that look like for a managed services delivery model, for instance?
Okay. All right. And then just to wrap up, where can people go to find out more about Indico Data?
So, obviously indicodata.ai. You can always check my website out at slater.website.
Excellent. All right. Thanks for being on the show, Slater. I appreciate your time. That was awesome.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
Cool.